Okay, this is the sixth topic in our course on language documentation and description, verbal arts and music. Some of the main ideas that are covered in these readings are the cultural and scientific value of documenting verbal arts, the idea of verbal arts as part of language endangerment, the challenges in interpreting and translating verbal arts, music endangerment as a parallel to language endangerment, and some practical information about how to document music in a language documentation project. These are the 7 suggested readings for this week. Those that are considered required for this course are Fitzgerald 2017 and Grant 2014. Fitzgerald 2017 is an overview of why verbal arts should be included in language documentation, published in the Journal of Language Documentation and Conservation. Fitzgerald points out that language documentation has brought about a renewed interest in the verbal arts and the analysis of text, that this interest in verbal arts and the study of text has provided insights for some of the structural aspects of linguistic studies, and Fitzgerald gives several examples of insights into phonology that have come through the study of verbal arts. That verbal arts has also proved useful for motivating community collaboration and training, and that verbal arts can be central in encouraging language revitalization. There's a quote from Fitzgerald: "There is a wide range of contexts where verbal arts are effectively deployed to support language conservation and the training of community members in the trenches teaching their language. Moreover, the analysis of the verbal arts is useful to advance theoretical and linguistic knowledge." The next paper by Nicotina, published in 2018, is an example of the study of verbal arts in an African language. Nicotina is working with the Wan language, where the number of speakers is growing, but the language is still considered endangered by its own speakers, and this is because fewer people in the language group can master storytelling techniques. In other words, the speakers' perceptions of language endangerment don't align with the generally accepted methods for assessing language vitality. Nicotina gives detailed examples of some of these storytelling techniques in Wan, including idiophones, logophoricity, the use of demonstratives with fixed references, and others, and then gives the analysis of 2 texts for comparison. One showing how a skilled storyteller uses these techniques, and the other of a very ordinary narrative that wouldn't be considered an example of skilled storytelling in this context. Nicotina writes, "Language is understood by Wan speakers as traditional ways of speaking, and those can only fully be realized in specific communicative practices that are currently at the point of extinction. When such practices go out of use, the language is no longer regarded as properly transmitted to new generations. Its creative potential is considered to be lost, and younger speakers are thought to acquire an incomplete, impoverished version of the language, stripped of much of its cultural value." And another quote, Nicotina writes, "In many communities, language is valued not as a unique combination of vocabulary and grammatical features, but as the carrier of an oral tradition. It is that particular capacity of language that makes it worthy of documentation and study." Dobran 2012 is another example of text analysis, this from a language spoken in Papua New Guinea. Dobran applies verse analysis, a part of ethnopoetics, to a text in Arapesh. The speaker in this text explains how his understanding of the location of biblical events has changed from his previous views, in which he wondered whether the locations where the biblical events were said to take place actually happened on earth or in some non-earthly realm. The text has a 4-stanza structure, and in the second stanza, the speaker says how meeting a white person helped to confirm for him that these events were happening around real human beings just like him. And in the third stanza, the speaker recounts how had previously seen photo evidence where members of his own tribe had traveled to the locations where the events took place and brought back pictures. And Dobrin says that this order of the structure of the text shows that it was the meeting of the white people that was more important evidence for convincing the speaker of the physical or the earthly location of these events, and that the photo evidence was less important. There's also a moment where the speaker shifts to the language of water communication, Tokpisin, and Dobrin analyzes this shift as the speaker intentionally shifting to a modern perspective or a modern way of seeing the world by using what might be construed as a more modern language. In summarizing the paper, Dobrin writes, one aim of this article has been to illustrate the utility of ethnopoetic analysis for enriching our understanding of the ways in which narrative texts are not simply collected, but actively, if not consciously, produced over the course of the documentation process. My other aim is to highlight the implicitly dialogic nature of even monologic speech forms. Speakers are never just talking, they are always representing themselves to someone. This paper by Sass and Evans, published in the Language Documentation and Description Journal, discusses the challenges of translating verbal art texts. This paper first looks at the difficulty of interpreting a text from the Delabone language spoken in Australia by examining the various sources of meaning that may be needed for correct interpretation. This includes the translator's knowledge of the language, interpretive remarks made by the storyteller and others, other versions of the story that may have been told, gestures used by the storyteller, and potentially other contextual information that may not have been recorded, such as what the weather was on the day of recording. And the paper also looks at the difficulty of translating poems in a nearly extinct language called Arvanitika. The difficulty here is that the poems use metaphorical language that's no longer common knowledge among the people who still speak their language. In regards to the problem of translating the poetry of Arvanitika, the authors write, in a speech community like the Arvanitika one, where fluent speakers have become rare and knowledgeable persons with good memory of the earlier cultural contexts are even rarer, the interpretation of such material becomes a joint hermeneutic act in which both a considerable number of community members and the researcher participate. And speaking more generally about the difficulty of translating text, they write, the translation of a text is put together from many pieces, integrating material from a range of occasions, some recorded and some not. It is also an ongoing documentation process. Over a period of decades, new texts lead to the revision of lexical entries, and new discoveries of lexical meaning lead to the revision and sometimes retranslation of previously recorded texts. This paper by Kroll, Green, and Ellis from 2019 is another example of documentation of verbal arts. This paper introduces the Western Desert Verbal Arts Project, which is documenting the verbal arts of the languages of Western Australia. The documentation project covers respect registers, sign language, children's songs, games, narratives, and sand storytelling. They also make the point that documentation for analytic and scientific purposes can be complementary to documentation for revitalization rather than competing, especially when it comes to documenting verbal arts. This is an example of sand storytelling where the storyteller will draw lines in the sand as they tell the story. And although not mentioned explicitly in the paper, The documenters had to come up with some unique strategies for documenting this kind of multimodal storytelling, where one camera is focused on the speaker and capturing their face and gestures, and a second camera gives a top-down view of the sand art in order to be able to see what's happening clearly in the sand. Grant 2014 is a paper on music endangerment. Though this paper is focused on music endangerment, it's clear that the problems that are being addressed are similar to many of the problems in language endangerment. Grant takes the approach of what's called a wicked problem, which are said to be problems in which there is no definitive perspective on defining the problem or determining what its solution is, where interventions in the problem must be localized, and any intervention can add further complexity by changing the nature of the problem. In this context, Grant says that creative interventions can mitigate, if not solve, problems, but the overall problem, the complexity of the problem, should not be oversimplified. And that in this context, Grant encourages scholars to further engage stakeholders in collaborative efforts rather than trying to apply simplified one-fits-all solutions to the problem. In describing this wicked problem, Grant writes, "It will be prudent to keep in mind that the processes will not be fast or easy, and that wicked problems are by their very nature never definitively solved, not least because the problems themselves cannot be defined clearly. It is for this reason that drawing convincing, workable solutions to the problems of endangerment, both in specific context and generally, is neither possible nor desirable." On a more positive note, Grant writes, "We may take a leaf out of the book of sociolinguists, who continue to tackle the wicked problem of language endangerment with fierce passion and commitment, despite the enormity of the task, with pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will," in Antonio Gramsci's well-known words. Scholars can play a range of important roles in ameliorating the trajectory of cultural endangerment. The last reading is a chapter by Barwick on music documentation in the Oxford Handbook of Linguistic Fieldwork. Barwick points out ways in which music is comparable to language as a human universal, and then looks at how music fits into language documentation. First, she points out that documenting music is part of the call of language documentation to record all kinds of language use. This would include the use of language in songs. She also points out how the documentation of musical forms can give new linguistic insights from a scientific or analytical point of view. Then again, that music documentation can facilitate community collaboration and language maintenance. And then Barwick gives some very specific recommendations for what's needed to document music, in addition to what's normally needed for a language documentation project. Barwick writes, "Since musical behavior is so widespread, so dear to human hearts, and so closely allied to language and other communicative codes, linguistic field workers are urged to take advantage of opportunities to work with their community collaborators to record and document music and dance when feasible." So a few possible further resources for anyone who wants to research this topic further. The first two are PhD dissertations that have recently come out of the University of Texas at Austin, looking at the analysis of verbal arts in languages of the Americas. Third is a book by Ruth Finnegan that's cited by Nicotina as one of her sources for studying the oral traditions of Africa. And the last is a book by Grant where she further elaborates on music endangerment and how it's related to language maintenance.